It's nice to be back in here. Again, hope you're all enjoying. Had a good break. This is talk about, well, what's been happening in terms of safety, but even more importantly, what our new Z standard says. Because when I say new, it is a revision. The industry, has been doing this since the 70, and it's going to be the Z133 2026. It's done. I know you've heard that one before, but it is coming out here pretty quick. So, this is actually a good time to talk about what's been happening and again, what Z standards we have to help reduce the frequency of some of the and severity of some of these incidences. So, again, this is not intended to be an interpretation of the standard in any way. It is just an overview of some of the revision. And I should add that if you read Arborist News, and by the way, I think it's a great magazine, you'll find that Tim Walsh and I have a series of updates on the Z, starting out with just what's been happening and then going section by section by section. The last section will actually be in the next issue. So if you want to have an overview of what's been going on, I encourage you to go back and read these articles that have been going on for about the last year on the Z. All right, well, let's start out with you. You're getting old. Take a look at yourself. Look at the person sitting next to you. We're not getting any younger. Now, I'm double that age easily, so I understand this. But with arborists, we're getting older, and there's not a lot of backfill behind us, people. We're not attracting a lot of young people in this profession. So, unfortunately, we're going to get older and older and older, and at some point here relatively soon we're going to be beyond the medium age to it unless we do a lot more recruitment. And frankly, being old is not good for arborists. The other thing is the number you do want's less than 4. And what do I mean by that? If we take everybody working in the United States today, all 140 some million people, we have a fatality rate of about 3.5 per 100,000. Now, we do that so that we can compare different industries. And trucking, as I'm showing here, is a industry with a lot of incidences. Unfortunately, a lot of fatal. They're seventh highest at about 27 per 100,000. And that it's an industry that we do share some commonality with. We drive big trucks as well. Logging's often considered number one, fatality rate of about 98 per 100,000, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And as you might expect, going out there and doing this occupation, which we also share some things in common, chainsaws and trees, is a high risk profession. But what about us? We're actually lumped under what's called landscape servicing. So we're lumped in there with landscaping, planting trees, pruning small trees, lumped in there along with landscape design installations. So when you take a look at it, we're actually lumped in with ground maintenance workers. You're out there mowing lawns, landscape, and what they call, and I don't like what they call us, and that's tree trimmers and pruners. We're far more than that, but that's the federal government for you. That's what they call us. But what about just us? If we separate just us, it's 105 per 100,000. Wait a minute, that puts us number one. Now, a couple of surveys actually put us at a close second to logging. That is not where we want to be. But what the federal government has finally figured out is this is a high risk profession with a fatality rate far higher than most people anticipated. Now, if you go back and look what I've been writing the last 20 years, I said, wait a minute, the numbers are showing we're fairly high. And I don't mean that as a good thing. But it literally depends a little bit on how you define a tree trimmer and pruner. Is it just someone working for a tree company or what? But nevertheless, any way you look at it, we have a very high, unfortunately, a very high fatality rate. A way to look at it is we're 0.03% of the U.S. workforce. That's far less than 1%. Right? There's not a lot of us in this country. About a quarter of a million. But we're 1% of all the fatalities. That's a lot. Now, do you want to make it worse? Move to California. California, tree workers are about 3% of all their fatalities in that. So anywhere you go in this country, it's a fairly high number. Not picking on California by any means, but pick any state you want. We disproportionately have a higher rate of fatalities than proportional to the population of workers. And guess what? I'm going to blame everybody in that room there that's 45 years and older. That'd be me too. I'm over there beyond 65 away. We actually represent most of the fatalities. If you look at this chart here, the darker color is percent. Now, these are percentages, percentage of the workforce. So if you look, about 50% of our workforce is 34 years or older. That means the other half is obviously older than that. And if you look at the fatalities as a percentage, you'll notice, especially that young group, 25 and younger, 20% of the workforce, only 5% of our fatalities. Now flip and look at the 65 plus. That is fortunately only about 4% of the workforce. Yeah, you get some old guys like myself out there still working, but we represent about 8% of the fatalities. So my short answer is everybody in that room there, 45 years and older, you might as well quit. We're most of the fatalities. And I'll go over why here, and don't panic. But a common reason is as we get older, we tend to break rather than bounce. So we got to be we can't just assume since nothing's bad happened to us, nothing will happen to us, and really be good at our game and make sure we're just as safe as anybody else out there, because we represent the bulk of the fatalities. And in order for all of us to do that, whether you're a 20-year-old watching this or a 7-year-old watching this, number we really do need to follow is the Z133. It is a voluntary standard, but it's a standard adopted by our industry to provide safe work practices. Now, I'm going to go over some of the big changes. And one of the big changes in the new Z, the new revision, is skill training. Now, I'm going to cover that, but I also want to point out that within the Z, we have two words that are peppered throughout it. It's should and shall. You'll see more shells than should. If a standard says shall, that means it's mandatory, no exception. If it's a should, that's a recommendation. And with training, look at this. This is brand new for the Z. The employer shall require the employees to demonstrate competency before performing any safety sensitive task. That's everything we do. And you shall make sure they demonstrate competency. So now what is required on it's what the employer must do, shall do, is to ensure that their workers have the knowledge and skills in order to do to work safely. And those employees have to demonstrate those skills before going out and doing any task. In other words, how well do they operate a chainsaw? How well do they climb? How well do they fly the lift? And if they can't, you need to retrain them. Now, they do have training should be documented. I suggest that is a shall, not a should. But you also shall, through regular supervision, notice this, on an annual basis. You need to make sure, for example, if you have someone out there running chainsaws, once a year, someone's got to stop and take a look. Are they operating a chainsaw safely? Two hands, not walking with a running saw, wearing all the proper PP correctly. And you should document that. Okay, that's a big change. Annual basis, making sure that every employee is safely doing any of the tasks that we do in agriculture, flying the lift, whatever their job may entail. And if they're not, again, provide any additional training. We're going to see this change even more with coming ones, but now again, we finally have, for better or for worse, a training portion to the Z, and I think it was time to finally get it in, and I'm in agreement with it. That we want to make sure we actually have trained people actually going out and doing the work. They have the knowledge and the skills in which to do this, but it's on the employer to make sure of that. Well, what's happening out there? Climbing. That's still one of our most common reasons for a fatality. Climbers who die tend to be a little bit older. Again, getting back to that, we don't bounce, we break now. In the old days, we used to free climb. I don't know how we remember that from the 70s, but you'd free climb a tree, sometimes tailing a rope behind you. Well, that's changed. But so has our climbing practices after the last 20 years. Nowadays, we're doing a lot of stationary rope systems. And so our primary suspension point, we're completely dependent on that holding it. Now, that was a change from even 94, where we had to have a climbing line positioned over a branch union around the trunk. Nowadays, for canopy anchors, we're often doing this. And there's nothing wrong with this inherently. But if that anchor fails, we're in for a long fall, and we're seeing more of this. Now, we did have in there, we'll test it. Test it by having two people bounce or tug on it. Guess what? That's not a valid way of measuring it, and that has been removed from the current Z. And here's the reason. You get two people pulling on that, they're pulling with a force on that anchor of about 0.6 their weight, about 240 pounds. One person climbing it is putting a force equal to their weight at all times. And when they're really pulling, a force higher than that, up to 1.4. Brian Kane at UMass has written some excellent articles in Arborist News that have given the numbers behind this. And so the problem is that two people tugging on it is not exerting the same force of the anchor as one person climbing on it. So it gave a false sense of security. I might mention falls, the higher the fall, the more likely it's going to be fatal. 15 feet, about a 90% survival. You might say, how do you die from a 15-foot fall? Well, your head hits first. At 30 feet, notice that it's about 50-50. Anytime you're climbing above 30 feet, the odds are more that you'll die from that fall than you will survive. If we get fractures and ruptures, when you start falling from a 70-foot fall, you're bouncing through the tree and our survival rate plummets. So every foot you gain in height, keep in mind you've actually increased the risks as well. So manage those risks. Well, how do we do it? We make sure our anchor will hold. Nowadays, what you'll find in the new annex, things you should be looking for to determine whether the anchor will hold, not just relying on the fact that you've gave it a bounce test and that should hold it. Another reason you fall, well, guess what? You only had one form of protection, either your climbing line or a lanyard, and you cut through it with a chainsaw. In the Z, it will make it clear when climbing, an arborist shall have on their person at all time a climbing line and at least one other means of being secured. And both shall be used when you're operating a chainsaw. So it doesn't matter how you got up that tree, there better be a climbing line with you. And if you're going to be cutting with a chainsaw, that climbing line is being utilized and that being secured, because what happens is somebody ends up cutting the only line that they had as their fall protection. As a minor point, we have changed the breaking strength requirements. If you look at our old manila rope, that had a breaking strength of about 2,600 pounds. Our new ones have far higher. Our old systems have been quickly replaced. And so we removed that 5,400 for minimum braking strength and dropped it to 5,000 pounds. Why? Because all our other hardware is rated at 5,000 pounds. Only the climbing line was higher than that. And so to keep everything in line, it was moved to 5,000. Well, struck by a falling tree. This one, it's about the same percentage, or by that, the same age for our industry here. The same average age is still almost the one that's being killed too. So essentially any age can be struck by a falling tree. And there's two reasons for that. Either it's the uninvolved worker standing closer than two times the tree height and struck by the falling tree, or the chainsaw operator was not moving along the retreat path. Hope you like my artwork. How you make your cut, we have not changed that. It's up to you, conventional, open face, or Humboldt. We just have that the knot shouldn't be more than a third, and you have to leave a suitable hinge. If you're doing conventional, notice that the back cut typically is made slightly higher. The reason being is, in order for that tree to hit the ground, it's got to snap off that hinge. Because the, well, excuse me, snap off the hinge, because you're closing the cut and the tree's still falling. With the open face, it's made at the apex. Why? You can have that tree reach the ground and the hinge literally bends that far because the tree will reach the ground before it's completely closed that notch. This is one reason we tend to use this quite a bit, not exclusively, but quite a bit, because we want to make the hinge work longer. Well, take a look at this. I'm working on one side of the street, another crew's working on the other side of the street. You're not going to see anything really wrong here, but one, don't have the ground people on the phone texting while you're getting set up for the cut. And the other thing is, look where you're making the notch. I like to stand on the side and let the saw do the work because now I can use the sight and make sure that my notch is lined up to where I want the tree to fall. That wasn't done in this case, and he's not doing anything, quote, wrong, but now he's got a little bypass, so he's going to end up cutting, whoops, sue me, cutting that as well. And this is where I really don't like to be. He's going to be on his knees cutting up. Well, where's the kickback zone going to be? It's going to be his face. Try working from the side of the tree. Well, everybody stops to watch every time you're felling a tree, and no difference here. The crews are all watching, and this went well. He's got everything ready. They do have a rope on it, but now we do have an error. And the error is he is standing next to the tree rather than walking along his retreat path. You're always supposed to be moving along your retreat path, 45-degree angle back. All right. The second top of the tree begins to move or the back cut begins to open. Most of the chainsaw operators that are killed within about 10 feet of the base of the tree. Why? They were standing there, not moving, and they were struck by the tree as it rolled or kicked back. Well, the other half of fatalities are to the ground crew. And what we're required to do is give a command when we're ready to start the back cut and not to do the back cut until we have a response. We have removed what language to use from the Z. What you use as a command or response is up to your company and should be in your safety policy. But we didn't specify what two terms you use. But you shall use a warning before making a back cut and wait for response before proceeding. Now, where does everyone else have to stand? If they're uninvolved workers, they're not tending a pole line, then they need to be 2 times the height of the tree, 2 times the height. If they are tending the line, in other words, they're an involved worker, then they can be no closer than 1.5 times the tree height. So if we look at that, the chainsaw operator standing at the base of the tree, they have to in order to do the job. Involved workers no closer than 1.5 times, and then everyone else 2 times the height of the tree. If we followed that other half that's killed, people being struck by the falling tree, either the involved worker standing too close or someone just wandering by. In other words, they don't have anything to do for the job yet. Those are the ones that are killed, and we're trying to keep them outside that zone. Well, electrical is still our big one here. It's a three killer of tree workers. Everyone should have a fundamental knowledge of this. And I also want you to note that this is one area where we actually have a higher fatality rate among younger arborists than older arborists. The thought being that if you've been doing tree work for 30 years or so, you probably developed that sixth sense to be aware of the conductor, that you've looked for them. Otherwise, electricity kills young as well as old people. So it's not that as you get older, you have tougher skin and they're not going to be impacted by it. It's just you've been working a long time, you have a higher situational awareness. And we have to know the entire system from phase wires to neutrals to secondaries to comm wires. The entire electrical system for for distribution is something we're all supposed to be aware of. Well, how are we killed? Number one, about 26%. the branch you're cutting. You either just cut it or you're cutting it. It comes in contact with the conductor. Example here, Jamie's holding a branch and the branch makes contact with the wire while Jamie's holding it and Jamie dies. Now, interesting enough, the diameter of the branch is a factor in conductivity as well as its length. Palms, for example, we have a lot of palm fatalities, a lot of palm electrocutions. And even in the Z, we say, you know what, you've got to follow the standard on these because you touch a palm frond to a power line, it's amazing how often that kills people, just what they're doing there. And that Florida leads the country in electrocutions, and it's because of palms. So let me give you a quiz. What's more likely to cause an electrocution, a live branch or a dead one? Hopefully, you know it's a live branch, more conductive. All right. Second question. What's more likely to cause an electrocution? Holding a long branch at its base or a short branch when it touches the wire? Well, I think that's pretty easy. Holding the short branch is more likely to have an electrocution. Why? Because resistance equals length divided by diameter. So the more length of the branch, the more resistance you're going to have to that branch. But here's one that confuses people. Holding a large diameter branch or a small diameter branch. All other things being equal, the large diameter branch is going to cause more an electrocution. You might go, whoa, wait a minute, I wasn't thinking of that, but keep in mind that formula. Resistance equals length divided by diameter. Larger diameter is a larger hose. Think of it as a larger gauge wire. So they're more conductive, and that ends up killing arborists. They sweep a small diameter branch against the wire and they get a tickle. And they think, well, that doesn't harm me. No, they just got lucky. They grab a larger diameter branch and do the same thing, and they're flat out killed. Number two, it's the conductive object you're holding, such as a pole pruner. And you shouldn't be carrying metal pole pruners in trees. Quite often, these happen because no one did a good job inspection, and they were unaware that a power line was even up there. But these are the second most common killer. And notice now we've covered about 50%. What's number three? It's direct contact. Aerial lift operators, surprisingly enough, they back into the wire and they directly contact it with their shoulders. Or they're touching the wire while they're touching the tree, or their pole saw is doing so. The fact that you're in a bucket doesn't mean that you cannot not have a fatality, that you cannot conduct electricity. Well, next it's the ground workers, and they're touching the truck when it makes contact. We call this touch potential, touching the truck when it came in contact with the wire. But then we also have step potential. We're seeing these numbers increase. That the knuckle of the boom came in contact with the wire, in this case, like a 7 kV line, phase to ground. In the actual incident, this happened. Step potential. Since the person had the 2 feet apart there was about 500 volts 12 feet from the truck. You know what 500 volts will do? It can throw your heart in a VFib. This is very common where we see the need for doing CPR, that when someone ends up dropping because of step potential. Now, once again, you don't want to approach that person if that knuckle of the boom is still in contact with the wire, but it's swept away so it's safe. These are the cases where we're not dealing with burns, but the need to do CPR because their heart is in fibrillation, though we can have some tissue burn. Well, what do you do when you feel that little tingle? Feet together. Feet together. Why? The potential is now the same. We have no difference in voltage. And if you don't have a difference in potential, you don't have current, and current is what kills. So the feet together, and you shuffle away, heel to toe, so the 2 feet are always touching each other. Well, how far do you shuffle? Some of you might remember back in the 90s, they told us 6 feet. No. Before you break into a run, 30 feet for distribution voltages. Shuffle away. I don't care if you shovel to the next county, but we get too often people start breaking into a run too soon. Now we have a greater distance between the 2 feet. We now have potential, and you're going to have current, and it may be enough to throw your heart in a V-fib. We've also changed your names now. We no longer have the incidental line clearance arborists. We have electrical level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this determines your minimal approach distance, how close you reach, or your conductive tools come to the conductor. This is the new chart. You want to take a picture of it, go right ahead. You're going to see this outlined in it. I'm going to go over each part of it. It's pretty involved, but I'll try to simplify it. And let's start out with the level 1 arborist. Now, this is somebody unqualified for any voltage. By the way, this includes communication lines as well. A level 1 arborist cannot be any tree if an electrical supply line or communication line comes within 10 feet of the canopy. Not even if they're the other side of the tree. So think of that. This is any dark line in the sky, if it passes within 10 feet of the tree that they intend to be in, either on a step ladder, a stool, climbing, aerial lift, even if they're working the far other end of the tree, no. If you're a level 1 arborist with minimal training, okay, you're done. A level 2 arborist is a new category, and they need to know the entire electrical system. They need to know so they can identify what's a primary and neutral, and even all the communication wires. They have to avoid contact with any lines 300 volts or less. They may not touch them. And they have to maintain 1 foot 6 inches from everything up to 750 volts. Beyond 750 volts, they have to stay 10 feet away. However, they can be in a tree that's closer than 10 feet from a primary line, but their person or the branch they're cutting may not be within 10 feet of that power line. So, in other words, they can prune around comm lines and service drops. Now, the level 3 is what we used to call the incidental line clearance arborist, and they can work closer to primaries, and they have minimal approach distance that go up for 2 feet 9 inches, 2 feet 10, 3 feet 4, but above 35 kV, they're 10 feet away. So everyone in the room that's familiar or are the incidental line clearance arborist, you'll just now be called a level 3 arborist. And you know all parts of the system. You've taken electrical hazard classes. You know what a transformer is and does. You know how to identify secondaries. You how to identify primaries. You know what a voltage regulator is. You know all the rules and regulations to safely work in that electrical hazard. If you're a line clearance arborist, meaning that you're employed by the utility either directly or indirectly, you're a level 4 arborist now. Okay. And that, again, only applies to people, and you've got your own minimal approach distances. But the big changes are the level 1 and 2, and they even apply to landscapers. If you're a landscaper trimming a tree, pruning a tree, excuse me, a small tree, and there happens to be a service drop within 10 feet of it, you cannot be there unless you have the training and experience. In other words, at least a level 2 arborist. It doesn't matter what you call yourself, you are an arborist if you're being paid and working in a tree. The new hazard too under electrical are radio frequency safety. We have all these small little towers dotting. This is on my own campus. This might be sending signals, it might be receiving signals. You cannot tell just by looking up at these things, whether they're beaming a signal out or receiving a signal. And some of these can do both, but they're dotting the landscape now because we all use our phones for data transmission. So all these small little cell towers are actually beaming to larger towers ascending at greater distances. Now, you have to stay away from these. How far? It's not as far as you might think. The inverse square law says you double the distance, 4 times less power. But I'll talk about how far here in a minute, but it doesn't mean you have to be miles away. Also, you have to consider that all these cell towers shall be considered active. The good news is the FCC requires each site to be labeled with a cell owner. This is the same tower you just saw, and it has right on there that it's owned by Verizon. And here's the number I have to call before working beyond this point. Now, that point is on the pole, but you also need to look at a distance out away from it because you don't want to be in that beam. Now, this information is not in the Z, but I'm going to tell you, you're going to find that little card has 3 different colors: blue or green, yellow or red. I don't see a lot of blue and green. Those towers, the exposure may exceed the general population minimal permissible exposure, but not the occupation. You do see a lot of yellow out there, and those indicate it may exceed your occupational limits. My recommendations: you should notify your supervisors, remain outside any distance the provider requires. When I asked Verizon for the ones out inside of ours, they told me 20 feet. Fine. If it's red, okay, that can exceed 10 times the limit. Now, when I say must be shut off, that's my recommendation. This is not coming from the Z. They don't have that specific. But I want the person standing there telling me they shut it off. That's an awful lot of energy. Fortunately, you don't see a lot of these out there. Most of what you're going to see dotting the landscape are the yellow. Well, there's that same tower. How do I know what it's doing? How do I even know it was there before I showed up? There's that tower, and it's on a map: www.cellmapper.net. If you go to that, there's a paid site and a free site. But you can look up where these towers are, give them an address, and it'll show. In fact, you know what I did today? There's you. And I punched in your address or the address of the embassy suite there. And I asked for Verizon 4G towers. Tell me where there are. And there they all located. Once you're used to using this map, you can take a look and you'll know if you're going to find one of these near any trees you're working now. Now, if you're in residential areas, it's not a big deal. But if you're in commercial areas, you're in near any sporting events, you can find these. And you don't want to have the crew find one when they show up. Obviously, you want the bidder to note these and put it in that they ought to be shut off if they need to be. But you know what? It doesn't hurt to type in an address and check this map. I use it. It's great. A common recommendation is not to work any closer than 6 to 15 feet. My suggestion is to call the cell provider and follow their requirements. I will also say this is not ionizing radiation, it's a thermal reaction. And so you can stick a pole pruner up there all day. And I will tell you, the providers like it if you clear any branches that are actually interfering with their signal. So this is one you'll find they'll actually work very well with you. And you're required to let your employees know everything I just told you, that there are hazards. It's a thermal reaction. You do not want to get burned by this, that you should stay away from it. You should follow the provider's recommended distances. And there is a number you can call if you need it shut off. All right, well, let's keep going. What about struck bys? Well, struck by falling branches. Notice again, now the age is a little bit older that you die from this. It doesn't mean you're older to be struck by it. You're just going to pay the price a little bit more. And these are about 13% of our fatalities. You're up there, you're cutting a branch. Hopefully, you've given the command beforehand that you are going to cut. You can use any term you want, and you don't make the cut until you have a response from a ground person that makes it aware that everyone knows you're about to cut a branch and you're all staying out of the drop zone. What happens here is we have no command and response system. Jamie, look out is not a command and response. You need to tell them that before you make the cut, because otherwise they're going to get hit like this. And unfortunately, the larger the limb, the more likely the outcome is not going to be favorable. We do have it that a drop zone shall be established. So do you need to set up a drop zone? Absolutely yes. Does it have to be visual as you're showing with these flags? Actually, we don't require that. What we say in it is it's up to you how you decide to keep the public safe. If you want to use danger tape, that's fine. If you want to use flagging, that's fine. But we say it shall be established and people shall be excluded. But whether it's visible is up to you. That's a should, not a shall. But what defines the drop zone? We have a work zone. That's where all of your activities occurring. But within that, we have a drop zone. And is that drop zone the area just beneath the tree? Is it the area beneath where you're working? Actually, no. What defines it is the area beneath workers aloft where the potential for struck by injuries from falling objects occurs. So what does that mean? If someone gets hit by a falling object, perhaps it bounces, they were by definition in your drop zone. So be very liberal when you're establishing your drop zones. You can't argue, well, he was struck, but he was outside the zone. Aerial lift falls are at about 1 in 10 of our fatalities. Tends to be the older workers. They're often flying these more. And so when you're out there flying these, the big reason you fall over, either you overreached and you weren't wearing fall protection, or the boom was hit by a branch which bounced you out of the aerial lift and you weren't wearing fall protection. This is common. Jamie wasn't wearing fall protection and fell out of the bucket when it was struck by a falling branch. So what do we have in there? You shall wear fall protection, right? It shall meet certain requirements. Now, you're not allowed to use body belts anymore, what was called fall restraint. You still could tumble out of the bucket with these, but now you're being supported by a very short lanyard and that could snap your back. So these have not been allowed for a long time. But the two we do allow, fall arrest. This is probably what most of you are wearing when you're flying the lift. That you could tumble out of the bucket, but you don't hit anything because it arrests your fall. There's also travel restraint. Travel restraint, notice that you're clipped on both sides, not with one, but with both. You cannot fall. You are restrained by staying in the bucket itself. Now, some people don't like wearing this because most of the systems, it limits your movement. You can't turn around very easily. But nevertheless, it's a great way to make sure you don't leave the bucket at all. However, since this is what most of you are wearing, make sure you're wearing it properly. We do have that as a requirement that it has to be adjusted. And here's a good example. Drew here was wearing his properly. If you take a look, the clip was right between his shoulder blades and his chest strap was on his chest. When he stepped off a beam, what happened is he's still in a vertical position with the chest strap on the chest. Now, all we do is loosen it so that it's actually in his back rather than between the shoulder blades, merely 3 inches. Now, look how he's being supported. That can seriously hurt you if you fall out of a bucket. Okay, it can harm your neck, it can break your back, it can do a lot of internal injuries. And guess what? We even had it where you're asphyxiated because now the chest strap is actually too high and cutting off breathing. Also, consider you could be almost 6 Gs in that fall. So you don't want to wear these things too loose. Neck, back, groin injuries are all possible. So here's the way you wear them. You make sure the attachment is between the shoulder blades. Otherwise, you could end up with spine and neck fractures. You want to have the chest strap mid chest or for women slightly above the breasts. Too high can cut off airways. You also want to have the straps just below the buttocks and it's snug on the thighs, but not tight against the groin. You want to have a 2 finger rule, but not any looser than that. Otherwise, what will happen? You can end up with severe groin injury and it can pinch off blood flow and increase the possibility of suspension trauma. What else do we require? You have to carry a handsaw. The other thing, too, is if you have a chainsaw, and almost all of us do, you have to have a chainsaw scabbard in the inside of the bucket, not outside of the bucket. If the chainsaw is too long, okay, well, then the bar's too long, then you can have the scabbard outside, but you have to tether the chainsaw when not in use. But if you're up there, you shall have a handsaw with you at all times. What else? Well, now we're getting down to chippers, about 38 years old. This is interesting because most people think it's the new person who actually ends up going through the chipper. They are not. They're still scared to death of chippers. It's somebody who's been operating a chipper for 15 years plus that gets too complacent, either pushes something with their hands too close, or heaven forbid, stands on the infeed table. Well, a couple of basics here. Make sure you actually are crossing these, not letting them drag like this when you're hooking it up. Cross them and don't let them drag. You need about 5 inch clearance so you're not sparking. And when you're running these, have you ever read these things? Don't stand on them. You will be injured. I like this. Just do not touch. It'll kill you and it'll hurt the whole time you're dying. So here's Jamie working for the Dangerous Tree Service. And what's Jamie doing? Pushing too far with the hands. Hold right in, okay, to clear that jam. And guess what? The studies we've done showing Jamie can go through that out the chute in less than a second. You don't have a lot of time to react when you're going through a chipper. The other is we get ropes going through chippers. So here's Jamie once again, but this time you've got a blue climbing line that got pulled into it. You know what happens? That'll pull through, grab Jamie, throw Jamie right up against the chipper and snap their neck or decapitate them. Make sure your brush pile is separate from any climbing lines or rigging lines. And don't ever stand on the infeed table and don't ever push the brush through beyond that plane. It can grab you, and unfortunately, it does. So feed from the side. Wear tight fitting gloves. Don't stand on the infeed table. It's surprising we even had to add that. And watch the gloves you're wearing so they will not catch either. Instead, use a push paddle if you can, or a longer branch. I like push paddles. It's kind of funny. I was talking to a manufacturer at one of the shows, and I said, does anyone ever come back and buy a second push paddle? Almost never. You are allowed to do that, though. If you end up feeding a push paddle through, get another one. It's a great tool and far better than using your arms or a metallic scoop shovel. Oh, and the other thing we do is we sometimes drive over coworkers with these. Well, what about traffic? Well, about 2/3 of the time we're struck by traffic. The other third of the time we're struck by our own trucks. So make sure you've set up the driving zone properly. You are wearing high V. You're wearing cones. This picture's not showing the proper means. Cones with effective bans if you're in traffic that's more than 45 miles an hour and putting up work signs. But guess what? No one sees the signs. They're texting. So make sure you're very observant around any of the work zones. Coning is good. Make sure you've got the proper ones, but don't stake your life on them. Everybody here has felt the mirror go by and noticed somebody not even looking, texting. Unfortunately, we're not looking either, so we tend to back up over our own workers with our trucks. So, yes, you're supposed to have a reverse alarm, a backup camera, or a spotter. Okay, when you're backing up, making sure we don't back over a worker who's touching up a saw or such. The other problem we have is you have storm damage and you're cleaning this up, make sure you're always aware of any skid loader or that working out there as well, and the operator making sure that they know where everybody is standing. Unfortunately, these units do tend to back up over workers, and use the mirrors as much as you can. Palms, you know what? We don't have a good idea exactly how many people die from climbing palms. Reason being is a lot of these go unreported, surprisingly. They don't catch the notice. We can find them out of police reports or fire and rescue. And by the way, fire and rescue reports indicate there's far more than the government actually has reported to them. And that many of these are asphyxiation. Someone's working beneath the canopy of these, and as they're cutting the fronds, they tend to collapse on them. And so in there, we now have a separate palm section in the Z as to how you should be working in and amongst the palm skirts. And that, you know what, you shouldn't be working below them except under certain circumstances, and as much as you can, working out of them out of an aerial lift is far better. Chainsaws. They actually contribute a lot to our non-fatal injuries, but about 2% of ours are fatal. And I want you to look at the age. This is the youngest group that we kill. And who dies operating a chainsaw? It's typically a climber. Second, an aerial lift operator. Why? Help does not get to them in time. You get a cut wrist or that, you can bleed out before anyone reaches you. So no one handing, zero zip, nada. There is no exception. You may never do what you're seeing here in the picture, moving the controls of the lift at the same time you're operating that top handle chainsaw. A chainsaw shall be operated two hands at all times. And what we expect is that the left hand is around the forward handle, the right hand is around the rear handle. Now, we do have the employer can allow you to switch hands. Okay. But nowhere in here do we allow you to operate it with one hand. We're using a lot of powered saws now, too. These are getting extremely popular. And we even have a standard now for power pruning saws. These are all these little saws that are chain driven, but don't meet a chainsaw requirement. Here's a steel one, and I'll bet there's a steel dealer there that has these. Many of you may not be using these, but if you have a landscape crew like we do on campus, they love these tools for all the small pruning that they're doing. Now, I'm showing steel because that's our campus, but also because they have written very clearly on these that you have to use them at with two hands at all times. And guess what? They have a place to position that second hand. And we now have that in the Z. You can only operate these chain driven tools if they have a provision for the second hand placement, and you must follow that. We're not so much concerned about kickback. They're not going that quickly. What we don't want is you cut your other hand because you're holding the branch that you're cutting. And even though these are not quite a chainsaw, nevertheless, they can tear up a hand pretty darn quick. Since they're not a chainsaw, we don't have quite the same requirements as operating a chainsaw, but nevertheless, treat them with respect. By the way, some of the rules also include pole pruners. Pole saws, you do not need to be wearing chaps. The cutting blade is very far from your legs, but you still need hearing protection, head protection, and eye protection. Finally, stump grinders at 1%. Notice this group's a little bit younger than the average age at 36, though surprisingly, this is a job that many companies, it's the old fella, me, for example, that would be out there running the stump grinder, my age. That's what I had in many of the companies that I worked for. Unfortunately, we've seen the fatality rate increase on these. A lot of the units are not such like this, where the operator has standing behind that shield, operating the controls at all times. But instead, we've gone to a lot of remote, which allows the operator more freedom of movement. And unfortunately, they've taken advantage of that freedom to be standing up next to the stump that they're grinding, oddly enough, with the need they believe that they have to help clear that debris away from the spinning wheel. It does not, but unfortunately, their feet are pulled in by catching their jeans, or their feet are pulled, or in one unfortunate recent incident, the operator actually dropped down to use his hands to pull a root away. When it snapped, it dropped his head and he was decapitated by the stump grinder that he was operating. So stay away. You don't want to fall into one of these. And we do have that you have to be aware of underground utilities, of course, that everybody remain clear of the cutting wheel, that there's no secondary activity engaged, and that guess what? You remain a safe working distance away if you're operating it with a remote. Well, I took all my time, and I'm wrapping up with this, that if you follow everything carefully, hopefully you won't put into practice the aerial rescues and emergency response that you all need to be trained on as well. So let me finish with this, a reminder that on every crew of two people or more, two people must be trained in first aid CPR. So hopefully, if I were to ask for a show of hands in the room, and I'm not there to do so, I would find that many of you, not all of you, but many of you would have a current first aid CPR card from American Heart, Red Cross, National Safety Council, or one of the others. Because if an incident does occur, the knowledge that the crew has on how to properly care for someone is critical. And for injuries aloft, while we may have the skills to properly lower someone, do we have the medical training to properly care for someone? I know you're going to have a discussion on a aerial incident. I'm sure that'll be an excellent presentation. Please pay attention to it. We always can learn by what has happened. So with that, so that the next presenter can start on time, I will finish with stay safe, everyone. There's my email address. Please feel free to email me, and I will answer any of the questions I was not able to do so today because of the time and the fact that you can't catch me for coffee afterwards, as we often are able to do. Sorry I'm not able to be there in person this time. I hope the digital version of me was acceptable, and I hope to see you in person at a future conference. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll let you get on to your next speaker. So thank you very much.